Hello and welcome. My name is Carl, the channel is called Just the Way It Is, and today is part 2 of Dynamic ESA Explained. Now we're going on a little journey. On the previous episode, which was part 1, we looked at spring preload, and we had to understand that first before we get into the topics we're going to cover today, which are those other handlebar controls. On the right, we've got riding modes, so we are going to explore those, but in relation to the suspension settings. And then the other thing we need to finish with is the damping modes on the left-hand side. And we're going to talk about those and explain when and when not to use those. So we've got a lot to cover, but there will be a third episode. That third episode will be all about and nothing else but riding modes, and I'm going to explain it in as much detail as I can so that you have a good understanding of which modes to use and when. But that's going to be in episode 3. So in case you're wondering what on earth has Carl got this piece of wood with tennis balls on the end for, this is going to help us understand the IMU, the Inertial Measurement Unit, and that plays a vital key role in helping the bike control the suspension. And there's a lot going on you might not be aware of, because it is really clever and really fast. So we need to cover that in some detail so that you understand completely what the engineers have done in terms of designing the systems and the sensors on the bike to give us the best possible performance in terms of suspension. So let's get started. Riding modes. Now this is one topic that a lot of people get wrong, and they don't really understand what the riding modes do. There are those that say that the riding modes don't affect suspension settings, and this is just not true. I spent the last 2 weeks, I've done over 1,000 kilometers going up and down 5 completely different roads in all the different modes. And at 3 different speeds. I've been going slowly, I've been going at road normal traffic speeds plus about 10%, and then quickly up each of these roads in each of the different suspension setting modes, in other words, the riding modes. And I can tell you there's a difference. Every single mode, the suspension performs very differently. And this kind of is reflected, because if you get into the technical details and the technical write-ups that BMW have released, and you spend your time and you read them carefully, they also say this is what is the case. And there's some interesting things I've learned from this experience, and I'll come to that as we go along. So, riding modes. So at the very beginning, we've got Eco, we've got Rain, we've got Road, we've got Dynamic, and we've got Dynamic Pro. So we've got 5 modes specifically tailored for road riding. And that's what I can talk about with quite a bit of experience. But the last 2 modes, which are Enduro and Enduro Pro, I don't think I need to cover, because I'm not an experienced off-road rider. And I can't give you any definitive answers as to the difference between the 2. I don't go off-road and I'm not experienced, so I'm not going to try and convince you otherwise. So in terms of the 2 off-road modes, I can't really comment. But the 5 riding modes for the road, there is a difference. So leaving aside things like throttle response, dynamic traction control, and that sort of thing, we're just going to focus on the suspension settings, how the bike feels in each of those modes. So far, what we've covered is the automatic spring preload. This is the adjustment that we can make over here on the left-hand handlebar. We've not talked about damping settings, which we can also change, and we're not going to talk about that in conjunction with the riding modes at the moment, because it just gets complicated. And I think one of the things that BMW need to improve is they've took 2 words, road and dynamic, and they've used it in 2 different places. They use it to describe the riding modes, and they also use it to describe the damping settings, and it can be quite confusing. So we need to keep them separate for the moment. So in Eco, this is the softest, probably the most supple riding mode in terms of suspension quality that you can find and you can achieve from your GS. And at first I didn't think there was a difference between Eco and Rain, but there most certainly is. And you can really feel that, and you can try this yourselves. If you leave this damping setting button alone for the moment, and it's in road mode, and you select Eco over here, and you go for a ride, the suspension is really quite soft and quite malleable, and it kind of moves around quite a lot. And if you grab your front brake on and off, the front of the bike dives a little bit more. I know we've got telelever and it controls dive in a very different way to a conventional bike, but you can feel the front of the bike dive a bit more. But in particular on the rear, when you grab a handful of front brake, the rear suspension uncompresses. In other words, it rebounds really fast, and you can almost feel like a clonk as it comes all the way up to its maximum travel. If you then change that mode from eco to rain and go along that same stretch of road and do that same braking test, grabbing the front brake on and off, you'll find that the rebound control of the rear shock is quite different, and it doesn't allow it to come up really fast. It's much more controlled. So there is, without any doubt, a difference in suspension damping between all of the riding modes. Now, I can't tell you which one you're going to find best. You just have to try them all for yourself. In terms of the damping settings, and this is when we talked about the spring earlier on, what we didn't touch on is there are two types of damping control. Now, the first one is compressing. So when the spring is compressed, you can control, if you have an advanced shock absorber, the speed at which the spring compresses. So in other words, the spring, if there was no damping, the spring would oscillate and move up and down for quite some time, and this is called oscillation. But with the damping control, you can control the speed at which the spring compresses. So it will either compress quite quickly, or it will be more controlled in its compression stroke. In other words, when it's compressing. The other term they use is rebound, and that is when, once the spring has compressed, when it wants to return, when the load is removed or you've finished going over the bump and the spring wants to come back to its normal position, you also can control the speed at which this returns. So it can be a lot slower. So what BMW do is they control both the compression, the speed at which that spring compresses, and the speed at which the spring then returns to its position, an original position. So you have this compression and you have this rebound. So these are the two damping modes. So what you have with these riding modes is there is an algorithm that controls what those settings are for the compression and the rebound at any given moment in those riding modes. So in eco mode, everything's very soft and very loose, and it feels a bit, well, it's not uncontrollable, but if you ride slowly, it's fine. If you ride at traffic speeds, it's sort of okay, but if you pick the pace up, the bike gets itself tied in knots very quickly, and that's not what that mode is for. The eco mode has lots of other things going on in terms of engine management to give you maximum fuel efficiency. So this is where it gets a bit complicated with the riding modes, and we're just going to stay focused on the dynamic ESA element of the riding modes. Now, I always thought that the most comfortable mode was road mode, and then when the road surface is quite bad, I would flick on the handlebar on this side. I would change between dynamic to road. And if you go back to I'll put a link up, one of my earlier videos, I learned very early on that the thing to do to make life much simpler and easier is to only have in your TFT pre-selection only have two modes, so that then a double click of the mode button means you can change with a closer throttle from one mode to the next. You haven't got to take your eyes off the road, and I know if I double click that mode button, the bike is going to change from whichever one I had it on. So if it was on dynamic, it will change with a closer throttle to road mode, and I don't have to take my eyes off the road, and I explained that in a previous video. But I always thought that the road mode was the most comfortable. So when I got to really bad condition roads, lots of potholes and off camber, and the road surface is like this as opposed to being completely flat, and you've got all those tar lines on the road, that road mode was the best one to be in. But doing this test to see whether the suspension settings change throughout the different riding modes, I found that rain mode, believe it or not, gives me the best, most comfortable riding damping settings. So I've now changed from having dynamic and road to having dynamic and rain. Now obviously when you change the riding modes, there are other parameters that you change, but in terms of pure suspension and the control of the suspension with that compression and rebound damping, I find for me the most comfortable one is actually rain and not road mode. Now as you go along through the selection, the damping control becomes firmer. It's not a lot, but there is a difference between each of these modes. So it depends how quickly you ride will determine which riding mode you want. So for most people, I think road mode is the sensible, common choice that everybody will make. It gives you quite a plush ride, it supports the bike, and you can have a bit of fun in the curves and things don't get out of control very easily. But when you push on and you go that little bit faster, road mode in terms of damping control is not enough, and in that case you need to move to dynamic. Now in dynamic it changes the damping settings, and that's the control of the compression, the speed at which the shock absorbers front and rear compress, and the speed at which they rebound. And it really does make quite a lot of difference when you're going quicker at the normal road riding. So if you're a sporty rider and you like to crank it up a bit in your favourite curves and favourite bends, dynamic mode without a doubt is the place to be. So damping modes. This is the control on the left hand side of the bar, and this is the short press that will then enable you to change between road and dynamic. Now it allows you to make that change regardless of which of the riding modes that you're in. Now also don't forget that in the riding modes, when you change between modes, the automatic preset will be road. So for example, if you're in dynamic and you go to road, when you come over here and have a look, it'll always go automatically to road. If, for example, you're in road mode, but you've changed this to dynamic, and then it rains and you want to change to rain mode, when you change the riding mode to rain, it'll automatically change to the preset, which is what BMW have decided, to be road. So the first, so eco, rain, and road, those three riding modes have a preset automatically to the road damping mode over on this side. If you change to dynamic, which is the fourth one up, then this side will automatically change to dynamic. So you don't need to go along and change this setting. So why have BMW given us this option? Well, there are scenarios where you might like a little bit softer throttle control, a little bit softer power delivery, and you want that safety net in terms of ABS and traction control, a much bigger safety net to keep you safe, but you want that sporty feeling from the suspension. And what the engineers have allowed you to do is when you're in the road riding mode, you can then come over here, a short press of the button, and you can change it from road to dynamic. So in other words, what they're allowing you to do is to combine elements from different riding modes. So you've got dynamic, which let's just call that our sporty mode, and we've got road mode. And it's enabling you to take the suspension damping settings from dynamic and apply them to the road mode. Not only that, but they allow you to do it for all of the riding modes that are below. So you can also add the dynamic feel, that firmer control of the suspension, to eco. You can add it to rain, and you can add it to road, and it's actually really very good. So depending on the road surfaces, depends how fast you're going, you can, if the bike starts to move around more than you're expecting, you can go over here and change the damping mode from its standard setting, which will always be road for those first three, eco, rain and road. You can change it to dynamic. Now, the one more thing to understand, there are a lot of sensors on the bike, and they send a lot of information to the ECU. And one of those sensors is the IMU, the Inertial Measurement Unit. So I think what I should do at this point is try and give you a visual explanation of what the IMU does. So you might be thinking, what's he doing with a piece of wood and a couple of tennis balls? Well, this little prop is going to help me explain to you how the IMU works. And we need to understand that to understand how the engineers have created all these algorithms and the suspension profiles for our bikes. And it's quite interesting. So the IMU, if we think of that, it's a little tiny module. I've already showed you a picture. It sits underneath on the GS, it sits underneath the rear passenger seat. Now the module's about so big. Inside it, there are two types of module. There is a gyroscope and there is an accelerometer. There's actually three of each, but for terms of explaining this, we'll just call it a gyroscope and an accelerometer. And they each measure three different movements of axis. So the one we need to look at first is the accelerometer. So if you imagine this is the bike, look at the wood, don't look at me. This is the motorbike. We're going to look at the accelerometer first and look at the three motions it measures. The first one's really simple. It's the movement forward and it's the movement back. Forward and back. That's the first movement. The second one is even simpler. It would be, for example, when we're going in dips and undulations on the road, it's a movement down and it's a movement up. This is what that area of the sensor is measuring, down and up. The third movement that the accelerometer is going to measure is a movement to the left or a movement to the right. And that would be, for example, if you were turning into a corner and both wheels started to slide, the bike would move sideways. That's not going to happen very often, but that's what that sensor's capable of measuring, the complete movement of the motorcycle in unison, left or right. So the second part of the sensor, there is a gyroscope. There's actually three, and what they measure is something completely different. So the first one we're going to talk about is what they refer to as pitch. Now again, I'm going to turn sideways. Imagine this is the bike. When we get on the gas and we accelerate, the front of the bike raises, the back of the bike dips. This is called pitch. It's the same thing when we brake hard for corner entry, the front of the bike dips and the back of the bike comes up. So this is called pitch. The next one is called roll, but we can think of this in terms of lean angle. That's the easiest way to look at this one. So as we lean into a left-hand corner, the sensor measures the amount of lean that the motorcycle makes from its vertical position, both to the right and to the left. But not only that, it's going to measure the speed of change. So we could be slowly turning into a corner, or if, for example, we're on the S1000RR and we're slapping the bike into the corner, it also measures the speed of change. Now, the last one that the gyroscope measures is something called yaw. This is not so easy to understand, but I'll do my very best. So if you imagine I'm on the motorbike, we're traveling at a constant speed, we're neither accelerating or deaccelerating, we're not going left and right. It will measure a movement, a turning movement to the left or to the right. So you might be thinking, well, that's never going to happen on a motorbike, but it does. So let me explain. So again, this is the motorcycle. The motorcycle is traveling in the direction of you, the viewer. We're braking hard for corner entry, so the bike is pitching forward. The back of the bike has become very light and the back of the bike steps out. So although our direction of travel is still towards you, the viewer, look at the motorbike. The motorbike is now pointing in a different direction, and this is called yaw. So it means the motorbike is pointing in a different direction and traveling in a different direction. So it's got two things going on. So this also applies to really gifted riders like Casey Stoner and Valentino Rossi. So when they get to the apex of the corner and they get on that gas, what happens is that the back wheel starts to rotate faster than the front wheel. Something's got to give, something's got to move, so the back of the bike steps out. So although their direction of travel is still in a straight line at this point, the bike has changed its attitude and is pointing in a different direction. So the sensor is able to detect not only you're going around the corner, but the bike steps out of line. So again, although we're still traveling towards the corner, the bike is still at a different angle. So that's the IMU, but you also need to understand that the sensors not only measure these changes in direction, but they measure the speed of the change of direction, and this is really important. So on the front of our bikes, just under here on our front shock absorber, on the telelever unit, there is a sensor inside the shock absorber, and it measures the speed at which the suspension compresses. The same on the rear shock absorber. On the bottom, there's another sensor that measures the speed of compression. So what they're able to do when we're on our motorbikes and we get to a series of bends, we're going pretty fast, we turn into the bend really quickly, it is able to detect not only the lean angle, it can detect the speed at which we turn into that corner, and it also can detect the speed at which the suspension compresses. So if the suspension compresses quickly, the systems on the bike detect that really quickly, and they can close the compression valve circuit on the front or the rear, or both at the same time, in terms of the damper. So it slows the compression of the shock absorber down. In other words, when we're braking hard for corner entry and we grab a handful of front brake, the front starts to dip, that shock absorber and the IMU are all providing information to the ECU, and the ECU says, well, under those scenarios, we're going to offer support on the shock absorber. It closes the compression valve circuit and it stops that front shock absorber compressing too quickly. It is very, very clever stuff. There's a lot of other sensors all partaking in this decision-making process, and all of these data streams like throttle input, engine temperature, volume of air moving through those induction ports, it all goes towards making something called an algorithm. And then those algorithms generate what the suspension is going to do at any given moment, taking into account all this information from the sensor systems, also taking into account what you as a rider have asked for, not only in terms of riding mode, but in terms of rear preload setting and the damping setting. So there's an awful lot going on, and I hope that explains it a little bit more. Let's move on. So hopefully now you have a better understanding how the suspension systems, these three different systems, work on our BMWs. So we've got our spring preload on the rear. For pretty much 80% of riders leave it in auto mode. If you're helping passengers mount and dismount, you can use minimum to lower the back of the bike. And if you're more of a sporty rider, or you've got an awful lot of weight on your bike, you can set the preload to maximum. But for the most time, for the vast majority of time, you leave it in auto mode. And then with the riding modes, you can experiment with the riding modes, because all of the suspension damping settings change depending on the mode you use. You just have to pick the one that you like the feel of most. And then finally, we've got this damping button on the left-hand handlebar, and you can decide to move the sporty suspension feeling that you get in dynamic over here, and you can add it to any of those other riding modes. So you can add the dynamic feel of the suspension, that sporty feeling, you can add it to eco, you can add it to rain, and you can add it to road. So thank you for being patient. This episode has been another long episode. We had a lot to cover today, and hopefully you now have a much better understanding of how dynamic ESA works, how all the systems interface and the sensors work, and how everything gels together to give us BMW riders a very, very good set of options on our handlebars. And hopefully you now feel brave enough, you have enough understanding to go and have a play. You just need time. Don't go out with your mates, just go out by yourself and spend time getting to know your motorbike and which of these settings do what. Now you've watched the episodes, you'll know what they do when you push those buttons, and you'll probably have a good idea of where to start. But we all are different weights, different shapes, different sizes. We all like different roads. Some have completely smooth, flat roads and they do lots of motorway work. And some people like off-roading and they have B roads, terrible B roads like we do in the UK. So there are a lot of options to make our enjoyment much better with regards to suspension. So what comes up next? Well, we've still got part 3, which is going to be all about riding modes. We've got 7 riding modes on the 2021 onwards bikes, and we need to explore that in quite a bit of detail. We haven't really touched on traction control, ABS and throttle input and throttle profiles and engine management. We need to cover that in some detail. That's coming up in another episode, and I'm not sure where I'm going to add this into my series. These are my indicators from this bike. 2021, 2022 GS with multifunction indicators. They're gone. How on earth they got approved in Europe and the UK, I have no idea. And did you know that in the USA, the US of A, when BMW took this bike for approval, it has to be approved by the DOT, the Department of Transport. And when they did their assessment, they said, no way, we don't think they're safe. You can't fit them to your bikes when you bring them to the US. So they didn't get approved. And that is quite a reflection of the problems that we here in Europe and in the UK have with these multifunction lights. Not only are they awful on the front because they're amber as an amber daylight running light, which people then think are indicators, and I've had people, and I know you have had people pull out in front of you, but also on the rear of the bike. I've just come back from a 3,500 kilometre tour of Norway, and my friends hate them, they don't like them. They can't see what's going on with the indicator when you've got your brake light on, because the indicators have to perform three functions. They're a side light, a brake light, and an indicator, and it gets really confusing. So the new system that I've got on here does several things. A, it fixes the problems that I have with the multifunction indicators, but they look stunning. They're beautifully made, and I've been really impressed. It's changed the look of the bike, both from the front and the back, and we've got quite a lot of episodes covering these new kits. So, as always, my name is Carl. You've been watching Just the Way It Is. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you very soon.